If you're pouring your heart into your podcast, but still struggling to turn those listeners into paying clients, I've got something just for you. Imagine having a clear, simple plan to turn your listeners into buyers without relying on a huge audience or spending hours on social media. That's exactly what we'll create together in a podcast profit plan discovery call. During this free 20-minute call, I'll help you discover more opportunities for profit in your podcast and give you the next best step to turn your show into a client attracting machine. If I've got an offer that will help you expedite this process, then we can also discuss working together. Book your free podcast profit plan discovery call now by going to podcastingformoms.co/profit plan or by clicking the link in the show notes. I can't wait to chat with you. Have you ever finished recording a podcast episode and thought, this was really good? You hit publish, you see people downloading it, maybe even sharing it, but the clients, they're not showing up. Your podcast is getting listeners, but it's not turning into leads, inquiries, or sales. And that can feel incredibly frustrating because you've been showing up, creating content, and putting your voice out there. So today I want to talk about why your podcast might not be turning listeners into clients and what actually needs to change if you want your show to start supporting your business. Let's get into it. Welcome to Podcasting for Moms, the show for moms in business ready to start, grow, and scale a podcast that turns their listeners into buyers. I'm Jenny Sonneson, a podcast strategist and fellow mom entrepreneur. You're in the right place if you want to learn how to start and grow a podcast that attracts your ideal clients and really does the heavy lifting for you when it comes to selling your offers, all while balancing life as a busy mom. Are you ready to create a podcast that grows your income, impact, and influence? Let's make podcasting work for you because as moms, we know how to get things done. All right, let's jump into the episode. Hey, welcome to Podcasting for Moms, the place for mom entrepreneurs who want to build profitable, sustainable podcasts that generate leads and clients in part-time hours. I'm your host, Jenny Sonneson, a podcast strategist and producer for mom business owners who want their podcast to work for their business, not just add more to their plate. Because here's the truth. Podcasting can be one of the most powerful marketing tools in your business, but if and only if it's set up strategically. And if your show isn't turning listeners into clients yet, chances are it's not because podcasting doesn't work, but it's because a few key pieces are missing. So today we're going to be walking through some of the biggest reasons that this happens and how to fix it. So let's get into it. So the first reason is that your podcast doesn't have a clear role in your business. So a lot of people start podcasts because they think that they should, or because it sounds fun, or because everyone says podcasting builds authority. But if your podcast isn't tied to a specific outcome, it becomes very hard for it to generate results. Your podcast should support things like attracting ideal clients, educating potential buyers, warming up leads, demonstrating your expertise, and guiding listeners towards your offers. In other words, your podcast shouldn't just exist to create content. It should exist to move listeners closer to working with you. Without that clarity, your episodes may be helpful, but they won't naturally lead people towards becoming your client. All right, reason number 2. Your content isn't connected to your offers. And this is one of the biggest things that I see when I audit podcasts or work with people one-on-one for their podcasts. Their content is good, it's helpful, educational, but it's completely disconnected from what the host actually sells. So for example, someone might offer podcast launch services, but their podcast episodes are about general entrepreneurship or mindset or random marketing topics. When your content isn't connected to your offers, listeners may enjoy your show, but they won't automatically see you as a person who can help them. Your podcast content should live in the same ecosystem as your offers, meaning your episode should help your listeners understand the problem that you solve, see the value of solving it, and recognize that you are the person who helps with that. That's how podcasts generate clients, not through constant selling, but through strategic alignment. The third reason is that you're not giving your listeners a clear next step. So people finish an episode and you say, thanks so much for listening, and that's it. But listeners need direction. They need to know, what should I do next? Should they download something? Should I join your email list? Should they apply to work with you or check out a program? Without that guidance, most listeners are simply going to move on with their day. Not because they're not interested, but because you didn't give them a path forward. That is why I'm always talking about strategic podcast calls to action. Every episode should point your listeners towards something that continues the relationship. So it could be a free resource, additional private podcast, a workshop, a membership, or some other type of way to work with you. Your podcast opens the door, but the CTA is what invites them inside. All right, reason number 4. Your podcast isn't designed to nurture buyers. And here's something a lot of podcasters forget. Your podcast isn't just content, it's a long-form nurture tool. People often listen to several episodes before they ever reach out. They're paying attention to things like how you teach, your philosophy, your approach, whether you feel trustworthy, and whether they feel understood. Your podcast should intentionally help listeners move from, I really like this podcast, to, I think that this person could help me. That means that your episode should include things like stories from your work, client insights, perspective shifts, and strategic teaching, not just surface level tips. The deeper that you build trust, the easier it becomes for listeners to step into working with you. Then we have our fifth and final reason number 5. So you're missing the bridge between listener and client. So that means that there's no clear step between listening to your podcast and working with you. For most people, that jump is too big, which is why things like low-ticket offers, workshops, audits work so well. They create a natural step where listeners can move from passive listener to engaged buyer. Sometimes that bridge looks like an audit, a strategy session, a mini workshop, a toolkit, or a membership. And when you create that bridge, it becomes much easier for listeners to become clients. So if you're listening to this and your podcast isn't turning listeners into clients yet, please hear this. It doesn't mean your podcast is failing, and it definitely doesn't mean that you should quit. Most of the time, it simply means that your show needs a strategy alignment. A few small shifts can completely change how your podcast supports your business. And honestly, that is exactly the kind of thing that I help podcasters figure out inside my podcast growth op. We look at things like your podcast positioning, your episode strategy, your calls to action, and your client conversion path. So your podcast can start working as an actual client attraction tool, not just a content machine. So if that sounds like something that would be really helpful for you, you can learn more about booking a podcast audit in the show notes. And if this episode resonated with you, I'd love it if you shared with another mom entrepreneur who's wanting to make her podcast work for her business. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for tuning into Podcasting for Moms. I hope today's episode gave you the tools and inspiration you need to make your podcast work smarter, not harder. If you love what you heard, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It means the world and helps other moms in business find the show. For more tips, resources, and support, head to podcastingformoms.co. Remember, you're not just building a podcast, you're building your legacy. Until next time, friends.